Jason Evans was just a boy when his dad died, just one of thousands of people who lost loved ones. They were victims of tainted blood clotting agents in Britain. And today, a public inquiry into that scandal began. In the UK, during the 1970s and 80s, as many as 5,000 patients with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders were given a treatment called Factor VIII. But the clotting agent had been manufactured from contaminated human blood, and many of the people who received that treatment were infected with HIV and hepatitis viruses. Decades after the problem was identified, questions remain about how much was known about the risk and why the tainted blood product was used for so long. This public inquiry seeks to answer those questions. Jason Evans heads an advocacy group for victims and families affected by the scandal. We reached him in London.
Mr. Evans, you were there today at the launch of this inquiry. What was that like for you personally?
I think it was very vindicating because this day has been a long time in the making. For me personally, I've been researching and campaigning on this issue of contaminated factor products since 2015. And so today was really vindicating to finally have this inquiry happening. And, it was very moving, actually. And I think the whole community that was there today were happy. But I think overall, the feeling was probably a sense of cautious optimism, as I call it.
You were just 4 years old when your dad died in 1993. So what happened? Can you tell us the background?
Sure. So my father was a haemophiliac. And like most haemophiliacs in this country, in the 70s and 80s, he began using a new treatment for haemophilia called factor concentrates. And unlike the previous treatment, cryoprecipitate, which came from a single volunteer blood donor, these new products came from mixing the blood plasma donations of tens of thousands of donors. And the problem when you did that was that it only took one donor to contaminate the entire batch. And so my father was infected with hepatitis C and HIV, and he died in 1993 as a result of those infections.
Where had the blood plasma come from?
So the blood plasma donations were collected in prisons, Skid Row locations, from IV drug users, from prostitutes, and these were paid donors. And the problem when you pay blood donors for their donation is that it gives them a motive to lie about their health status or their lifestyle. And that's what was going on. And so you had what traditionally was a volunteer service in this country turned into a commercialized for-profit system. And actually, I believe you had much the same situation going on in Canada at the time, which the Creever inquiry in Canada looked into.
It was extraordinary, the Creever Commission and into Canada's tainted blood disaster, and led to many changes. But you've had inquiries, have you not? I mean, this won't be the first. Why was this never investigated properly at the time?
Sure. Well, as for why it was never investigated properly at the time, I suspect it was probably because the government and the ministers here were looking at what was happening in France in the early 90s, when an inquiry should have happened, where the former head of the French National Blood Transfusion Service, the CNTS, he was actually jailed for 2 years. Ironically, he was an English doctor from Cambridge originally. And I think the government and the ministers here were looking at this situation in France, and they were very distressed by it. So I would allege that a cover-up ensued. There have been previous inquiries here. We've had a Scottish inquiry, the Penrose inquiry. However, it was restricted to Scotland. Circumstances between Scotland and England do differ. It couldn't compel witnesses or documentation from outside of Scotland, and all the decisions at the time were being made in England. The only other inquiry that's been had here was an independent, privately funded inquiry called the Archer Inquiry. It didn't have any statutory powers. It wasn't made by the government. And so it was much like if you were to decide yourself, okay, I'm going to have my own investigation or inquiry into whatever subject you like. You can go and do that if you wish, but you're going to have no powers to compel witnesses or documentation and very little funding.
And then why have they decided to do it now? Why has this inquiry been launched?
Well, I think it's interesting that just the November of 2016, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, had actually written a letter saying there will be no inquiry into contaminated blood. And it all reached its pinnacle in the July of 2017. All within the space of 1 week, three big things happened. We lodged a group litigation at the High Court against the government for their role in infecting people with these viruses. We hit the front page of the most read newspaper in the country. And thirdly, we had a letter that was signed by all opposition political parties saying there should be an inquiry into this scandal. And so I always say to people, we had three parts of action. We had the press, we had political, and we had legal. And those three things together really forced the government to announce this inquiry.
You are part of a group that is fighting to get this. You're successful. How many people died? How many other people are like you who want to know what really happened?
Well, in terms of the numbers of people that were infected, at the time there was anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 haemophiliacs who received these contaminated treatments. We know that around 1,200 of those were infected with HIV, and the majority were dead by 1996. But the main organisation which I'm involved with is called Factor 8. And then under that we have a group called the Fatherless Generation, with people like myself who have lost a parent to these infected pharmaceutical products. And within that group we're aware at the moment of around 110 people who have lost a parent.
You now believe that you finally have an inquiry that's got some teeth, that has some powers to get people to talk, to get the testimonies you need. What do you hope comes out of this?
I think what we hope for is one very simple thing, and that's the truth. Following that Scottish inquiry that I talked about, there was a conclusion reached from that inquiry that said that there was little that could or should have been done differently. And my personal goal when I began campaigning was to change that phrase, to say that there was a lot that could and should have been done differently, and to show that this scandal that happened, that almost wiped out an entire generation of people with haemophilia, was actually completely avoidable if it was not for the profit-making mentality of the pharmaceutical companies and the money-saving mentality of the British government of the time.
We will be watching. Mr. Evans, I appreciate speaking with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Jason Evans is a campaigner for victims and families affected by the contaminated blood scandal in the UK during the 70s and 80s. We reached him in London.